It happened in front of hundreds of people, and not one of them expected history to change in less than 10 minutes. A struggling single father stood quietly at the edge of a glittering corporate charity exhibition, holding a faded black and white photograph that everyone assumed was worthless. The CEO laughed at the worn frame, mocked the man's desperation, and suggested it belonged in a thrift store instead of an executive gallery. The room erupted with uncomfortable smiles. Then a renowned Sotheby's senior art specialist stepped forward, examined the photograph for less than a minute, and calmly announced that the original print was estimated to be worth $18 million. Every smile disappeared. The CEO's confidence shattered. The single father didn't celebrate. He simply closed his eyes, remembering the one person who should have been standing beside him. Before we continue, if you believe kindness is stronger than pride, forgiveness is more powerful than revenge, and everyone deserves a second chance, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel to become part of our growing community. Graham Mercer had never imagined that one old photograph could become the center of the world's attention. To him, it had never been an investment or a collectible. It was simply the last gift his late wife had left behind before illness took her away. Every morning, after making breakfast for his 10-year-old daughter, Eliza, he would dust the cracked wooden frame with extraordinary care. The image showed an ordinary-looking city street filled with children running through puddles after a spring rain. There were no famous landmarks, no celebrities, and no obvious artistic brilliance. At first glance it seemed almost too simple to matter. Life had not been generous to Graham after losing his wife. He worked long hours restoring antique furniture, earning just enough to keep a small apartment and provide for Eliza. Bills arrived faster than paychecks. His truck had nearly stopped working. Medical expenses from his wife's final months still haunted his finances. Yet despite everything, Graham refused to become bitter. His daughter often noticed that whenever someone treated him unfairly, he simply smiled and quietly said that pain should never become permission to hurt someone else. Eliza inherited her father's gentle heart. She understood they could not afford expensive vacations or designer clothes, yet she never complained. Instead, she proudly packed homemade lunches, helped her father sand old furniture on weekends, and reminded him every day that they already had everything important because they still had each other. One bright Saturday morning, Graham read an article about a prestigious charity exhibition hosted by one of the country's largest investment firms. The event invited guests to display meaningful historical objects whose proceeds might eventually support children's education. Although Graham had no intention of selling the photograph, he hoped someone there might know more about its mysterious history. His wife had once whispered that her grandfather believed the picture was unusually significant, but nobody had ever investigated it seriously. The headquarters building looked impossibly elegant compared to Graham's modest life. Luxury cars lined the entrance while photographers welcomed wealthy donors. Graham arrived wearing his cleanest jacket, carefully carrying the photograph inside a protective cloth. People barely noticed him, some assumed he was maintenance staff. Others thought he had entered the wrong event. Graham ignored every suspicious glance because he had promised Eliza he would simply ask questions and return home before dinner. The exhibition's host was the company's celebrated CEO, Preston Hawthorne, a businessman admired for enormous financial success but criticized for arrogance hidden beneath polished speeches. Preston enjoyed surrounding himself with rare paintings, priceless sculptures, and famous collectors. To him, appearances mattered almost as much as profit. As Preston greeted influential guests, he spotted Graham standing alone with the faded photograph. Curiosity quickly became amusement. When Graham politely asked whether anyone knowledgeable about historical photography might be available, Preston glanced at the worn frame and laughed loudly enough for nearby visitors to hear. He joked that the old picture looked as though it had survived a flood, suggesting it belonged in a bargain bin rather than beside museum-quality art. Several guests laughed politely, unwilling to challenge the powerful executive. Graham felt every pair of eyes settle upon him. His face reddened, but he remained calm. He simply thanked Preston for his time and turned to leave. At that exact moment, an elderly gentleman entering the exhibition paused after noticing the edge of the photograph. He requested permission to examine it. The room grew quieter because many recognized him immediately. He had spent decades authenticating historic photographs for Sotheby's and museums across Europe and North America. His reputation was built on discovering overlooked masterpieces hidden in ordinary places. He removed white gloves from his pocket before gently lifting the frame. Seconds passed, his expression changed from curiosity to astonishment. He inspected the paper fibers, the printing process, the aging patterns, and a nearly invisible signature hidden beneath the lower corner. Silence spread across the exhibition. Finally, he looked toward the organizers and explained that everyone should be extremely careful because the photograph appeared to be an exceptionally rare original print from one of photography's greatest early masters. Preliminary evaluation suggested an estimated auction value approaching $18 million, pending full authentication. The room froze. Guests who had ignored Graham only moments earlier suddenly surrounded him, reporters reached for cameras, collectors whispered excitedly, even Preston Hawthorne seemed unable to speak, yet Graham wasn't looking at any of them. His hands trembled as memories flooded back. He remembered his wife smiling while wrapping the frame in cloth years earlier. She had insisted it wasn't valuable because of money. She believed some objects carried the love of generations and should never be measured only by price. For the first time since losing her, Graham cried openly. The art specialist quietly asked where the photograph had come from. Graham explained that his wife's grandfather had rescued boxes of abandoned belongings from an old building scheduled for demolition decades earlier. Among forgotten letters and family keepsakes rested the mysterious photograph. It remained with the family through marriages, hardships, and relocations until eventually reaching Graham's wife, who treasured it despite knowing almost nothing about its origin. News spread rapidly throughout the city. Within days, authentication confirmed the unbelievable discovery. The estimate remained unchanged: $18 million. Television stations celebrated the remarkable story of the overlooked single father whose treasured family photograph had stunned the international art world. But Graham surprised everyone again. Instead of announcing luxury purchases or extravagant plans, he quietly continued working in his restoration workshop. Customers found him sanding tables exactly as before. When journalists asked why he hadn't changed his lifestyle overnight, Graham answered that sudden wealth should never erase the values learned during difficult years. Preston Hawthorne found himself unable to forget the humiliation of his careless judgment. For weeks he replayed the moment he had mocked Graham. He realized the photograph had exposed something far more valuable than hidden. It had revealed the poverty inside his own character. Eventually Preston requested a meeting. Many assumed Graham would refuse. Instead, he accepted. They met during a sunny afternoon inside the same exhibition hall where everything had changed. This time there were no cameras. No reporters, only two men carrying very different burdens. Preston admitted that he had spent years measuring people by clothing, confidence, and financial status. Graham's quiet dignity had forced him to confront the emptiness behind his own success. He apologized without excuses, acknowledging that public embarrassment would have been easier to accept than recognizing how casually he had wounded another human being. Graham listened patiently. He remembered all the difficult mornings after losing his wife. He remembered every unpaid bill. He remembered how helpless he had felt while strangers laughed. Yet he also remembered the promise he had made to his daughter: pain should never become permission to hurt someone else. He accepted the apology, not because Preston deserved immediate forgiveness, but because Graham refused to let resentment become part of his future. That single act affected Preston more deeply than any business victory ever had. Over the following months, Preston transformed his company culture. Scholarship programs expanded dramatically. Hiring practices became more compassionate. Employees were encouraged to recognize character before credentials. Community partnerships focused on struggling single parents, inspired by Graham's resilience rather than his fortune. Meanwhile, Graham finally decided what to do with the photograph. After long conversations with Eliza, he chose not to keep it locked inside a private vault. Instead, arrangements were made for the masterpiece to be auctioned under careful preservation agreements. The proceeds created a charitable foundation honoring his late wife. The foundation funded art education, grief counseling, scholarships for children who had lost parents, and financial assistance for single mothers and fathers rebuilding their lives after unimaginable loss. thousands of families eventually found hope because one ordinary man refused to let wealth become his destination instead of his purpose. Eliza watched the foundation grow with quiet pride. She often visited schools where children painted colorful pictures without worrying whether their families could afford supplies. Every smiling face reminded her that her mother's love had somehow continued reaching people she would never meet. Years later, the restored photograph toured respected museums before finding its permanent home in a public collection where anyone could admire it regardless of income. Visitors stood before the famous image searching for artistic brilliance. Many discovered something even greater. The real masterpiece had never been the photograph alone. It was the story behind it, the story of humility defeating arrogance, compassion overcoming humiliation, forgiveness replacing bitterness. A father choosing grace when revenge would have been easier. Before we reach the end of this journey, we'd love to hear from you. Please leave a meaningful comment sharing what touched your heart most in this story, or tell us whether you believe forgiveness is stronger than revenge after someone has deeply hurt you. As sunlight streamed through the museum windows one peaceful afternoon, Graham stood quietly beside Eliza watching strangers admire the photograph that had changed their lives forever. He smiled not because of the millions it had earned, but because the greatest treasure his wife left behind had never been hidden inside the paper. It had been hidden inside the lesson that every human being carries unseen value, and that the world often mistakes quiet dignity for weakness until truth finally speaks for itself. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Remember that kindness costs nothing, humility never loses its value, and sometimes the greatest fortunes are discovered only after someone chooses to see the worth in another human being.